Hi, my name's Alex Stavda, and I'm here today with Fiona Dent from Ashridge Business School and Simon Gallen from Personal Strengths UK, and we're going to talk about the Strengths Deployment Inventory and influencing. The first thing I'd like to ask about is why is it so important to understand about someone's priorities when you're trying to influence them?
I think it's important to understand priorities from two perspectives. First perspective is to understand your own priorities in terms of what you're trying to achieve when you're influencing someone. The more important perspective is to understand the priorities of the people that you're trying to influence. Because when you're influencing, what you're trying to do is to get people to buy into your ideas and want to work with you. And if you don't put yourself into their shoes, then the likelihood of you getting their buy-in is significantly lessened. So there's something about forgetting about just your own priorities and actually looking at other people's priorities.
So Simon, how can the Strengths Deployment Inventory help us understand about our own priorities and the priorities of others when we're trying to influence them?
Well, the SDI gives us insight into where these differences come from, the different priorities that we all have. It's a common misconception that we are all the same. We tend to think that there is a lot of common sense and things are obvious. There are obvious solutions or methods of achieving certain goals. The reality is we've all got our different way of doing things. So as we're talking to each other, we're constantly translating the intent from the other person. So the more I can learn about someone else's priorities and match their priorities as well as my own while we're trying to influence, then the more likely we are to achieve a win-win outcome.
So what can we do as managers to get under the surface of things a bit more and understand more about people's priorities?
What I tell people when I'm using the Strength Deployment Inventory and other instruments and when I'm talking about influencing is that you should be observing people and you should be watching for the kind of typical interpersonal skills that they use when they're interacting with others. You should be looking at the ways that they actually behave when they're in meeting situations. You look at the ways that they like to work, the sort of things they like, the things they like to do. What you're trying to do is to assess how others behave and therefore what their particular priorities in life might be, what it is that motivates them and what it is that turns them on and turns them off, so that it helps you to get a picture of that person to enable you to work more effectively with them.
I think one of the things that Fiona talks about in her book is that idea of first impressions. And we will, as a general rule, we'll try and create a very positive impression when we meet people for the first time or if we're presenting in front of others. And we've got an idea of what that good impression looks like, whether it's a dress code, whether it's a style of speaking. Our intent is not always received in the same way. So, for instance, if there's a person in the audience who has a strong association with someone that they've had a negative experience with in the past, maybe a manager or a presenter, and let's say I walk onto the stage with the same walk, the same kind of swagger, or maybe I've got the same accent, what they do is they recall this and they say, I know what that means. So we need to be aware of history and how people perceive the behaviours and the actions of each other.
So Fiona, you mentioned about first impressions and getting to know people through observing them. Is this a good way of helping us overcome any preconceptions we might have?
First impressions are all very well and they help you get started, but it's really the lasting impressions and the developed relationship that you have with someone that really helps you to understand them. I mean, I know myself that I sometimes, for the reasons that Simon just said, or that you find something in common with someone, so perhaps you're both Scots, or you both work in HR, or you both have an interest in football or something, so you suddenly sort of think, I'm going to like this person, and I'm going to find them easy to work with. And then after a while, whether that's minutes or hours or days or months, you suddenly realise that you're not that similar. It's simply that you've got one thing in common. And I think that's often what first impressions do. You look for the similarities, but lasting impressions and getting to know someone really well is all about spending time with them and observing them and gathering those cues and clues that will help you in the longer term.
So getting to know their priorities, what motivates them, rather than just going on first impressions.
And I think being aware of the process, as human beings, we're determined to be right about things. We're determined to make sense of what is going on around us. So if we recognize certain behavioral traits and we link it with another person from years ago, we're likely to lock onto that, and we stop looking for new evidence. So one of the things that we try and encourage is for people to be prepared to be wrong. So if I'm prepared to be wrong about that negative impression that I may have had, that allows me to take in more information that gives the other person a chance to create a positive impression with me.
So if we've created a negative first impression of ourselves, what could we do to understand more about the relationships or to try and influence the person to help overcome this first impression?
One of the things that I look for is if it's not an immediately positive effect, I try and remember that basically we all do want to create a good impression. We all have some level of positive intent. So I try and give them the benefit of the doubt. And one of the ways I try and explain this is if you've ever worked with people who use English as a language, but it's not their mother tongue. So maybe they're struggling with English language. You know, maybe because of their accent, it's not their mother tongue. And the way that they explain it might not be exactly how the Queen would say it. And it might even mean something completely different. But because you know that they're trying and they're making an effort, you think, right, I think this is what they probably meant. And what you can do is then test it out. So even if we're both speaking English, I could say to you, I'm not sure what you meant by that, Alex. Could you explain it a little further? Or is this what you meant? So give people the benefit of the doubt first, rather than condemning them with that first impression of, oh, that's not the right thing to do.
So you've mentioned that asking open questions can be quite helpful. Why is that so useful when trying to influence people?
Questioning is probably one of the most important influencing skills that a manager can develop for a whole variety of reasons, because it helps you to frame for common ground. It helps you to understand where the other person's coming from. It gives you an opportunity to check out things that are maybe not certainties for you. Buys you time in order to think and plan and focus on where you're going to go next. And it's a hugely underutilised skill when it comes to influencing.
So what types of questions could we ask as managers if we want to understand what motivates someone or what their priorities might be?
I think outcomes. Generally, people have an idea of the tasks that are ahead of them, but there may be other layers of things that are important to them. So they might have a particular business task ahead of them, but one person might say, and I would like to really make sure that this is completed with the least disruption to the personal lives of the members of the team. Or somebody else might say that I really want to achieve this task, and it's right that we should get the recognition for this in the company newspaper. Or so there'll be some other underlying priorities. So by researching and finding out what would be the ideal outcome for that individual, you learn more about them. That gives you a greater chance of satisfying those needs. But also you've got your own needs as well. So then what you're trying to do is incorporate or design some kind of method that would incorporate both of your goals. Because I don't want to achieve my goals at your cost.
Okay.
Because there's too many people can use authority to get things done the way they want to do. But that's not really influencing in the truest sense of the word, because I can get things done short term by giving you an order or bullying you to do it. But the level of commitment that you may have to me and to future tasks would be diminished. So I never want to do things at your cost. It needs to be satisfying both of our needs.
So by asking lots of questions, we can help satisfy both our needs, and then we're more likely to get commitment from the other person over the long term. So what happens if we try and influence someone and we really don't consider their point of view?
One of the big dangers is that you end up with your view only being considered. So that could diminish the quality of the end result. The other thing is that if that person has been brought into the dialogue because they felt they're being involved and you suddenly ignore their viewpoint, then that might put them into conflict. If they perceive that you're not working with them, then they might try and work against you.
It's a bit like going into a defend-attack spiral, so that if somebody's picked up that you're not listening to them, perhaps a natural human reaction is to go into, you will listen to me, so you put forward your perspective, but you probably put forward your perspective more insistently because you feeling that they're not giving you the time to explore the issue with them in a balanced way. So you're feeling under conflict, and therefore your behaviour perhaps isn't as eloquent and effective as it might be when you're feeling that things are going well. So there's something, and it's one of the reasons I like using the Strengths Deployment Inventory, is that it looks at the two perspectives of when things are going well and when things are not going so well. And very often when you're influencing, if you're not getting onto the same wavelength as the person you're influencing, then what happens is you end up in a conflict discussion, and you're confronting one another, and you're not going on a nice even track.
Yeah.
So the issue is not going to get anywhere. So there's something about recognising what it is that pushes you into conflict, but also being aware of when somebody else's behaviour is changing and that they might be in conflict now as well. And the Strength Deployment Inventory helps you to understand that sort of behaviour.
So in an influencing situation, you might find that someone's behaviour changes quite quickly when they're put into conflict. And if you don't pick up on that and that they've been put into conflict, that won't help you really influence the situation. And could that maybe put you into conflict yourself?
It could put me into conflict. It could put you into conflict. We might both go into conflict at the same time. What we do know is that if you spent time learning from the SDI to recognise how these priority shifts in yourself and in the other person, you can recognise them and you can do something about it early, because the priorities change. So the priorities of one person at one point could be, I'm trying to get the best solution to look after the welfare of the people here. If their conflict reaction was more challenging, if they suddenly met with opposition, then they might try and beat the other person just to get their way. And a lot of this is, it comes back to this idea that we want to create a good impression, we want to achieve something for our self-worth, something very positive. And we have a set of rules, the unwritten rules, and there are expectations of what is appropriate and inappropriate behaviour. So as we go into a negotiation or an influencing situation, I will have a set of expectations that I'm looking for in you. You will have a set of expectations that you're looking for in me in terms of the way that I'm trying to influence or communicate with you. If at any point either of those expectations are not met, it is likely to create a different reaction. So a key skill is finding out what the expectations are, working towards the common goal between the two of us, and if we do spot a change, knowing how to react to that appropriately.
So it seems like from needing to do all these kind of things, we might need to slow down a bit in influencing situations. Why might it be useful for us to slow down and think things through more?
I think influencing 2 or 3 sort of important things to consider. First one is that patience is a real virtue where influencing is concerned. Influencing is not an event, which is what you just talked about.
Yeah.
You want to go in and do something. Influencing is actually a process, and depending on your character and the way that you relate to others and the way you process things in your mind, you may well be the sort of person that needs to go away and think about an issue. On the other hand, you may be somebody that just goes for it just like that, just straight away. But it's different strokes for different folks. I think the other, it's the $65 million prize really, is that planning and preparing for influencing is probably the biggest tip I can give any manager. If you just spend 3 or 4 minutes planning how you're going to influence the other people, you'll probably do 10 times more than most of the other people around you. And it usually gives you a real edge in an influencing discussion.
So is the SDI, the Strengths Deployment Inventory, something that individuals and teams can use to help plan and understand influencing situations better? So you could learn more about the team and where their priorities lie.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in a team environment, that's when the differences really do come out. So what the SDI can do is it can highlight the differences between the individuals in the team, but more importantly, it gives them a common language, because it's pretty difficult to describe what you're feeling, what you're experiencing, what you're thinking in another person's language. So we provide a common language, and then you can get to discuss what the individual priorities are, what you're trying to achieve.
So it could be quite a similar situation for the team, but quite different priorities in that situation.
Yeah, I did it once with a team here at Ashridge, and I can still remember them discussing it during the afternoon that we were doing the course, and suddenly you could almost see and feel light bulbs going on with people that had worked together for several months, even maybe years, suddenly saying, "That's why you get irritated when I'm so detailed. I understand now." And that was just one example. There was lots of that going on where people were beginning to, just out of knowing a bit more about the theory of relationship awareness, making their own common sense ideas and processes up for how they were going to manage their relationships in the future.
So I suppose it's quite important to make the link between the influencing situation that you're in and the people that are involved, what their motivations are, how they view relationships. That could all affect the outcome of the situation.
I think there's, like most things, there's a tried and tested process that you can get a set of rules for how to influence, how to communicate. But of course, it involves people, and the variety of different priorities, the way that we use our language is so infinite that we need to consider that as well, because my version of any particular process could look quite different to the way that you would apply the same process.
So the SDI can help us understand a bit more about differences in relationships and the need for sometimes when influencing people to be a bit more flexible in our style.
I think a lot of it is when people are trying to influence me, then a big aspect for me is whether I trust that other person. And the different areas of the triangle within the SDI have different ways of looking for trust. So if you understand what another person needs to be reassured that your viewpoint is credible, that they trust you, that the outcome is going to be okay as far as they're concerned, then that would help enormously as well.
So understanding what motivates people, understanding what drives them and learning more about them can help other people be more likely to trust us. And that can be really helpful in influencing situations.
Which is back to Fiona's questions of unless you are interested genuinely in that other person's view and their priorities, and you ask them lots of questions to find that out, then you're never going to get there.
So you're saying that you need to be genuinely interested in a person. So do you think other people can pick up on when you're being false or fake?
Undoubtedly, yeah. There's a very thin dividing line between influencing and manipulation. And people's antennae will naturally be up in terms of recognising when behaviour is genuine or not genuine, and they can tell quite easily when somebody's trying to pull the wool over your eyes. You get that gut feel about it.
And if you miss it the first time, you get it the second time.
You get it the second.
So from what you're saying, maybe we don't spend enough time getting to know people, understanding about them. Maybe we focus too much on getting things done, and we should spend more time learning about the people we're working with.
And we also assume when someone says, are we clear that we're going to do this project, we assume that we all understand the same thing. And the truth is that we don't.
Thank you for your time today. I feel we've had a really good conversation about SDI and influencing.
Thank you.
Thank you, you're welcome.